Okay, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you might be. Welcome to this webinar sponsored by the Association of Architecture Schools of Australasia. My name is Chris Knapp. I'm professor and head of school at the Obedience School of Architecture at Bond University. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Climate Action in Architectural Education, which is a webinar series. Today's particular webinar is entitled Australasian Perspectives, which will examine current trends, opportunities, and challenges faced by schools of architecture in Australia and New Zealand. I would like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which the member schools of the AASA operate, and the land upon which our panelists today are also located. I would personally like to acknowledge the traditional custodians who are the Kumaberi clan of the Yungaber language group, where I'm currently based, and I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, for their wisdom, teaching, and cultural knowledge. Next. So we would just like to point you to the webinar series that we've been developing as part of the AASA really over the past few years. The webinar that was just passed on the global perspectives, and this one today, Australian perspectives, are being recorded and being uploaded to YouTube. So if you go to the AASA website, aasa.arc.org, you'll find a kind of wealth of resources, including our past events and other portfolios of information. So please make sure to check that out. And we do have an open call for our webinars. So anybody coming from a member school or as part of our kind of broader community, we're open to suggestions for webinars that we can run in 2022. So please go to the website to access the link to be able to submit your proposal. And those can be one-offs, they can be a series, but they can be considered by the AASA executive and membership to be able to put those forward. So we're very interested in hearing from you and helping to give a voice to issues that are of interest and concern to the membership. Okay, so getting on with today's agenda on Australasian perspectives, I want to just introduce the lead researchers of the Climate Action Project that's been undertaken for the past several months, including the conducting of a survey and the results analysis on the climate and education topic. So Dr. Liz Brogden is a lecturer in Transdisciplinary Design at the School of Architecture and Built Environment at the Queensland University of Technology. And she is joined by her colleague, Dr. Naima Iftikhar. Naima is an associate researcher in the School of Architecture and Built Environment, also at QUT. Over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be here. Very much looking forward to sharing the results of this research project with you all. And first, so my colleague and I, Naima, are online and we're going to be reporting on those findings. But first, I'd like to contextualise some of the background information associated with this research. So I don't think we're at a point anymore where we need to convince a room that climate change exists, nor do we need to show graphs to demonstrate climate change impacts and global warming trends. At this point, there's a fairly widely held consensus that climate change is here, it's happening. We know that we've already reached 1 degree of global warming and we're already starting to see the effects. And what's interesting as a point of reference, when I started my PhD in 2014 and even as late as 2018 when I did my final seminar, the facts of climate change were still considered debatable in public discourse when reporting on research findings, or at least it certainly felt like climate change had to be evidenced before it could be discussed. And so where people now begin to disagree rather is in how we should be responding. So what we're seeing in Australia, at least with these sort of large organisations like the Academy of Science or CSIRO or BOM and the Climate Council, as well as state and local governments, they're putting out these reports to quantify the impacts of climate change and help inform policy decisions. And this matters to architecture because we're seeing a trickle down of impacts, which are impacting industry and in turn education, which is being called on to respond. So at this point in time, industry seems to be leading the way in Australia. We're seeing shifts at a federal level recently with Zali Steggall's recent attempt to pass the climate bill. We're seeing state and local governments with climate resilience strategies and benchmarks being set around things like zero carbon emissions. The National Construction Code is currently under review around thermal energy performance. Our Building Codes Board is part of a newly formed global resilience dialogue between Canada, New Zealand and the US. And they're pushing for more current and also future climate data to inform building codes because our current climate data in the NCC can be up to 20 years old. On that topic, CSIRO have just released open source future climate scenario data up until 2090 for building and performance modelling. And the AIA has committed to a net zero construction industry by 2030. So specifically relating to architecture education, we're all going to be well aware of the current NSCA that has been reviewed and a new updated version released, which will come into effect and have a much greater emphasis on sustainability and environmental issues. So it's also really important to contextualise who our students are in 2021. There's a lot of research talking about how we've got a generation of students right now who are very anxious about these issues. It's affecting their mental health, and we're seeing the emergence of new terms like climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. And this is something that we need to be taking into account if we think about these people as the benefactors of our educational offerings. I'm going to hand over now to Naima, who's going to talk about our research design.
Thank you so much, Liz. The research design for the Climate Action and Literacy Project involves 3 phases. The phase 1 in 2020 was a pilot survey conducted as a scoping study of architectural schools leadership. The current phase 2 in 2021 was designed as an Australasia-wide survey to gather perceptions about climate change and sustainability education from all key stakeholders that are students, PhD researchers, sessional academics, and faculty staff in architectural schools. The main survey was designed with questions to explore what is being researched and taught at schools regarding sustainability and what role can architecture education play in solving the challenge of climate change, and what is the stakeholders' hope for the future of architecture. An analysis of the Likert-based responses and inductive thematic analysis of the qualitative responses will be reported in the presentation today. The phase 3 in 2022, which is still being formulated with the aim to develop some sort of toolkit, framework or roadmap for education and training in climate literacy for architecture education is being developed. We had 637 participants complete the online survey in October this year, which was sent to all architectural schools in Australia and New Zealand, and it was promoted through the AASA and the Institute and across multiple social media platforms. 410 students responded and 69% reported that they were in an undergraduate degree and 31% were undertaking a postgraduate degree. Out of the 92 faculty staff, 58% categorized as academic staff, 24% were course coordinators, and 18% were heads of academic units. Out of the 108 sessional staff, 74% are involved only in sessional teaching, and 26% characterized as both sessional and research scholars. Now Liz will provide an overview of the findings.
Thanks, Naima. So we're structuring the discussion today in 3 main parts. First, we're going to describe participants' positions on climate action through architecture education, illustrating very high levels of concern, but also strong motivation in architecture schools. Secondly, we'll provide an overview or snapshot of architecture schools right now and current activity in research, teaching and learning. And then we'll conclude with some trends and aspirations in architecture and architecture education, followed by a panel discussion with the whole team. So as mentioned, in terms of these high levels of concern but motivation, I'm going to run through some of the quantitative data initially and then illustrate the qualitative or text-based responses that came out of the data. So these bars that you're going to see show how different types of participants responded to a question as a sliding scale from very concerned to not concerned at all. So you can see this distribution shows very strong levels of concern about climate change and sustainability issues across all groups, with 95% of respondents saying they're concerned or very concerned about these issues. And when we look at the qualitative information, we're seeing that these concerns range from frustration around conservatism, frustration about ignorance or a sense that we're only paying lip service to the problems through architecture education, whereas others express concern about their own knowledge or expertise levels. And we're seeing that students often talk about concern about the future, their future employment prospects, or general concern for the future of planet and society. So despite all that concern, encouragingly, we see that 95% of respondents also strongly agree that architects can be part of the solution to climate change. And when we look at the qualitative responses, this is just a selection of quotes, we're seeing that while people are concerned, they're also very committed. And it translates to sentiments around personal commitment. So while people are expressing these concerns, they're also very motivated to help contribute towards solutions. So whether that's for the benefit of students or as a kind of professional accountability to ensure we don't fall short and allow for greenwashing or tokenism through our work as architects, there's also a strong commitment to upskill and develop further understandings, as shown in these sample quotes. So again, we're seeing a really strong majority of respondents, 95%, are agreeing again or strongly agreeing that they want to see more teaching about climate change and sustainability in their degree. But when it comes to confidence, we begin to see less consistency in the responses. So we're seeing more uncertainty in those neutral responses, whereas there's still a relatively high level of confidence in actual fact. If we see that the green sections are indicating very confident or confident, where people are feeling that they can be proactive when it comes to teaching about these issues. So the responses are ranging from about 70 to 80% agree or strongly agree that they're confident in teaching these topics. So when asked to comment on why they feel those degrees of confidence, I guess unsurprisingly, there's a correlation between confidence and an individual's activities or their personal passion, whether it's through research or in practice. So essentially, if people's work is connected to sustainability, they're more likely to feel confident teaching on these topics. And for students, confidence is more likely to be linked to curiosity or interest in the area. This graph shows perceptions of motivation depending on the participant type, but as well the participant type that were surveyed, but we've also asked people to comment on university leadership and also industry groups and practitioners. And we've combined self-perception with perception of others in this visual because there wasn't a significant difference between people's perception of self and other people's perceptions of them as well. So it shows that people see a decline in motivation to act, where students are most motivated, then academic staff, followed by school leadership, university leadership, and then industry groups and practitioners. So I'm going to summarise where these positions or values and beliefs on climate action and climate change are, and then I'm going to hand over to Naomi shortly. So in summary of people's positions, these two main themes emerged. We saw that people are concerned, but mostly confident. And we saw also a lot of qualitative responses to indicate that people are feeling obstructed by barriers that are preventing them from being more active in this space. So as I've illustrated using the data, there are very high levels of motivation in our participants. We're seeing that there's a correlation between personal passion and confidence. So where people's actions align with climate change and sustainability issues, they're more likely to be confident teaching about it. And then there were also some sort of complex responses around people's perception about their own level of expertise. So I think that there seems to be a lot of self-consciousness around somebody's their own background and whether they're equipped or qualified to be teaching on these topics. So saying, yes, I'm willing, yes, I'm confident, but I'm not an expert. And when it comes to these barriers, there were a lot of expressions of desire for more support mechanisms, the fact that pathways and information sources are sometimes obscured or unclear. So maybe people feel like they're feeling their way in the dark, or they don't know what sources they should be accessing in order to inform the courses that they're teaching. And also a lot of frustration around systemic scale challenges. So whether that be from a student's perspective, the school structures or the structure of the course, or even at a faculty level, and also sectorally. So there's this sense that architecture education is sort of situated firmly within a network of other factors that prevent progress in this space. So I will hand over now to Naomi, who's going to give us a snapshot of where architecture education is at right now.
Thank you, Liz. So the second main aspect of our findings for the study encompasses an overview of what is being currently undertaken through the research and teaching and learning activities related to climate change and sustainability in Australasian architecture schools. When asked the question, our school engages through research activity, PhDs and researchers are less convinced than academic staff about research engagement in this area at school level. When academic staff and research scholars were inquired if their individual research relates to climate change and sustainability, there is high confidence reported about one's own research relating to sustainability, which is encouraging to know that so many of our colleagues are actually active in this space. In response to the query about the range of topics being explored through research and the participants' individual universities, the most researched areas emerged are sustainable materials and construction, with occupant comfort and well-being. There is a broad range of research topics being undertaken as reported by participants, and the key research areas explored are sustainable materials and construction, passive design, housing design, regenerative design, Indigenous perspectives and methodologies, sustainable technologies, history and conservation, retrofitting and adaptive reuse, resilient and disaster risk design, and life cycle assessment. We found that the projects were being funded and conducted in partnership, and therefore there is opportunity to connect and collaborate across institutions and industry areas. However, it is sad to see that 27% of the research is unfunded. But when it comes to research partnerships, you can see that there are diverse opportunities across different sectors, as shown in the slide here. So this provides some important signposting as to what areas of research and partnership opportunities exist for us as a discipline at this point in time. When participants were asked how their school engages with climate change and sustainability through teaching and learning, compared to other participants' responses, students are most likely to report teaching and learning about climate change and sustainability. Faculty staff were asked about the status of their architecture program and if they require support to implement climate change and sustainability in the curriculum. Most of the academic staff plan to review their curriculum to determine if changes are needed, and a high percentage of staff have reported that there is a need for support to make the required curricular changes. The qualitative perceptions that we gathered reveal a strong sense of responsibility from both educators and students to make the required changes, both in the curriculum and the profession, where educators feel the responsibility to shape the future practitioners who consider ethical decision-making above aesthetics, and where the students feel responsible for the future of the built environment through adequate preparedness of the challenges associated with climate change and sustainability, as is reflected in these sample quotes. The students' quote at the bottom right corner of the screen, which says, "We are the upcoming generation who really needs to be making changes in the way we design, and it's crucial that we know about these issues and different ways of designing," summarizes the essence of this theme on feeling a strong sense of responsibility. In terms of the main topics taught across architecture programs in schools related to sustainability and climate change, there is a close consensus between staff and students on what is being taught, with the highest focus being on passive design and sustainable materials and construction. When exploring the modes as to how these topics are being delivered, all participants display greater uncertainty when identifying which unit types, where in the course are teaching sustainability and climate change topics, with design studios and environment and building science subjects being the highest focus identified by the participants. The findings on uncertainty about how the topics are being taught leads us to the theme that we identified on the problem of pedagogy found through the qualitative perceptions of all participant groups. The NSCA points to an emphasis on the curriculum review, whereas the qualitative data reveals that what we teach, as well as how we teach, go hand in hand, leading to the need to consider appropriate pedagogical approaches for sustainability. The students' quote on the slide represent the need for showing learners how to implement the relevant design strategies, while academics require relevant support mechanisms to enact changes. When comparing which units are better facilitating the climate change and sustainability learning and teaching, there is a cascading consensus between educators and students when identifying which unit types where in the course provide such learning opportunities. The need for higher order thinking is also a theme that emerges from the qualitative perceptions that supports the quantitative findings on uncertainty about which units and modes impart sustainability and climate change learning. All participant groups perceive that sustainability learning and teaching can empower future practitioners. This can be achieved through developing a systems thinking mindset, reflecting the deep empathy, care, and harmony for the planet, and a need to develop design approaches in collaboration with other disciplines. The representative quotes here on the slide by educators highlight the significance of the development of the systems thinking mindset, such as the quote by a sessional academic, which states, "Education of transdisciplinary thinkers is essential to workable, realistic, effective solutions for the upcoming environmentally conscious generations." Now, Liz will provide a summary of the themes that we have just discussed in this section about research and teaching and learning activities. Over to you, Liz.
Naomi. Thanks so much. So in summary, we saw that three main themes emerged during the data analysis, where we were trying to establish this snapshot of where architecture schools are at right now. So we see, as Naomi has really eloquently explained, we see this strong sense of responsibility articulated. We see this problem of pedagogy coming through in the thematic responses, in the thematic analysis of the responses, I should say, and also the importance of higher order thinking. So we do see some sort of sub-themes that sit under this, and we have quotes and data to support that this is a pattern across different respondents. So we're seeing that educators and students alike feel a really strong sense of responsibility to be part of the solution to climate change, where the role of education is seen as critical in shaping the future of the profession and built environment design, which is linked to notions of activism through awareness building and advocacy, as well as the notion that we should be inspiring or empowering and confidence building in our students so that future practitioners can opt for ethics above aesthetics in their design approaches. And there was repeated reference to this ethical responsibility bound up in sustainability and climate action, and the sense that more superficial aesthetic concerns can often be in tension with or compromise sustainable design. And people also talked about the importance of challenging the status quo, a phrase that came out a lot in the written, or typed, I should say, responses to the online survey, using terms that point to a desire often for radical change and transformation, where architecture is seen as a catalyst for that positive change. Oops, there we go. So the suggestions to this problem of pedagogy came out in the difference in responses when it came to where in the curriculum things are being taught rather than what topics. And we're seeing that there's a desire for deep, authentic learning and teaching that pushes beyond terms that were used, such as tokenism, greenwashing, or just paying lip service to the problem of sustainability. And this was linked really strongly to a preference for integrated learning opportunities that can be seen earlier in the degree rather than standalone subjects that are situated within a curriculum, and the importance of empowering academics and sessional academics through professional development and support mechanisms on these topics. And I think I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail soon, but this is really important because it sort of points to the idea that perhaps overhauling the curriculum isn't the solution or isn't the main problem here, and maybe that teaching what we already know in more effective ways could be a better way forward. It's also perceived that sustainability learning and teaching can empower future practitioners by developing a systems thinking mindset, reflecting on deep empathy, care and harmony, as Naomi mentioned earlier, and also connection and breaking down of silos, which is kind of the basis of integrated higher order thinking. So it's important to recall, and moving to the third section that we're going to discuss the future of architecture and aspirations and trends, is the survey was structured in these three sections. As I've mentioned, we were first hoping to understand people's positions or values and beliefs about climate change, but also to get a snapshot of what's happening now in architecture schools in Australia and New Zealand. But we also asked two more open-ended questions that were future-focused to try to understand how people visualise next steps and the future of architectural education, in the hope to gain a picture that highlights not only the problems or challenges that we face, but also hints at solutions or a roadmap or way forward for architecture education. So we asked, what is your hope for architecture more broadly? A very open question. And also, what role do you think architecture education should play in this? So that gave us a bit of a sense of how the future of architecture might be evolving. And this is not to say that the data is conclusive as this is what will happen, but it's definitely pointing to people's aspirations and where things are trending. So what we're seeing is that if we look at these main themes that emerged in terms of people's current positions on climate action and sustainability, and then also their research activities and teaching and learning within schools right now, and then match that against themes that emerged from those more future-focused, open-ended questions, it was really quite inspiring to see connections between themes where one was positioning a kind of problem or an obstacle and the other was pointing to the flip side of that, which might be a way of thinking to shift or transform architecture education moving forward and to be able to start integrating these things better within our course offerings. So what we saw, according to the 5 main themes, is that where people are concerned but also showing relatively high levels of confidence, the data was showing that there was this hope expressed that through engaging with climate change and sustainability issues through practice and education, that we might be able to see a revival or a reimagination of the role of architecture as a discipline, but also a profession out in society. Where currently people are frustrated or feeling obstructed by barriers at a systemic scale, perhaps that's more moving towards being confident to challenge the status quo and having a more active role in critiquing or challenging unsustainable futures. where people feel a very strong sense of responsibility, and evolution from that moving forward could be showing empathy and care. So a more proactive, solutions oriented rather than being stuck in the problem, or perhaps responsibility is more associated with carrying the weight or the burden or the guilt even of a broken situation. Where currently there's a strong focus on curriculum, perhaps in the future we might see that coupled with not just thinking about what we're teaching and what those topics are, but also a focus on pedagogy of how we're teaching it and what kinds of teaching and learning mechanisms that we might use in classrooms or even outside the classroom, and more innovative teaching and learning. And where the need for higher order thinking as inherently connected or integrated as the kind of counterbalance to frustrations around feeling like architecture is maybe disconnected or siloed. So I am going to open the floor at this point to the full team. We've got Associate Professor Philip Oldfield, who's the head of school at UNSW's Built Environment Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture. We've got Associate Professor Dagmar Reinhardt, who's in the School of Architecture at the University of Sydney. We've got Professor Knapp, who is the head of the Aberdeen School of Architecture at Bond University, and Professor Naomi Stead, who's a professor in architecture at Monash University. Welcome. We've got questions that we encourage everybody to please post your questions in the thread. Naima is actually in the chat thread, sorry. Naima is manning the chat. So at any point, Naima, please jump in if some questions come through that you think will help aid the discussion. And it's currently 3:30, so maybe what we could aim to do is have a 20-minute discussion and then finish up with some, maybe some more open questions from the floor. Does that sound like a good sort of structure for us to roll with?
Yes.
Good.
Great. Thank you so much.
No worries. I have a question that I'd like to put to Naomi first, if that's okay, Naomi. Mm-hmm. So as we were just, Naima and I just presented on this really strong sense of responsibility among architecture educators and also students who see that this is sort of falling on their shoulders moving forward in terms of the kinds of problems that they're inheriting as they're growing up. And I think in our discussions, we've talked about how architecture is so frequently positioned, or positions itself perhaps is a better way to put it, as the conscience for the sector. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts to add to this in terms of how we can transform that sense of responsibility into more kind of care and empathy-based ways of practice.
Yes, well, it's a really good question because I don't necessarily have the answer. I suppose I see it as more of a problematic, really, something that needs to be addressed, because I think when we find that architects are framing themselves as being the conscience, as you say, and they're coming up against builders, developers, clients, regulatory organisations who don't hold the same values, then that's a heavy weight for an architect to carry. So the question really is about the relationship between responsibility and empowerment. How much agency do architects actually have to work and be effective in this area? Sometimes it's a lot. Sometimes it's really not very much at all. And, where the architect raises questions of caring for country, or indeed empathy and care, as you mentioned, not to mention sustainable materials and the goal of zero carbon buildings, sometimes that will definitely fall on deaf ears with some clients. So I guess that's not a reason not to do it, of course, although in that moment, the architect is always thinking about maintaining their relationships, being taken seriously, not seeming to be like hopelessly wet liberal or something like that. So it's quite challenging, I think, for particularly students. So let's imagine that there was a student who was completely skilled up and totally knowledgeable about sustainable principles and how to apply them. Like, let's say this all works and students are coming out with that knowledge and the ability to apply it. They're still going to run into roadblocks. So they also need to know how to become an advocate and how to, what are the workarounds that you use? How do you convince people? What are the levers that you can pull? Sometimes they're quite subversive, I think. Sometimes they're even not unethically so, but sometimes you can pursue your values and environmental agenda using very clever techniques like redoing the modeling or recalculating the figures. But I guess, exactly as you said, I think the question of responsibility and the weight of that responsibility seems to fall very heavily on architects as the kind of, I use this expression deliberately, good guys of the built environment. It's a heavy weight to carry.
Yeah, thanks. I think you speak really about some really important sort of ways of thinking about these challenges in terms of sort of top-down or bottom-up grassroots activism, like pointing to the power of perhaps sometimes subversive ways that we can enact change. And maybe often architecture education, especially, or universities, can feel sort of caught in this middle ground between aspirational thinking of what we want students to believe that they can achieve in the world, and then the reality of industry that's bound by client and often developer interests as well. So that, I think, Dagmar, would you mind, I would really love to hear from you about, on the back of that kind of way of thinking, what kind of opportunities you see, like how these I've lost my page. I'm going to go by memory now. What the opportunities you see in terms of engagement between higher education and industry. So if we're talking about how architecture education can sometimes feel caught in these top-down mechanisms, how we can kind of break out of architecture schools and connect across sectors.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Liz. So I was while Naomi was talking, I had this image in mind of architects going to the barricades, the revolutionary architect that's sort of entering everything. And so what I've been thinking is it's sort of slightly the other side towards that, because what I've been thinking is through how can we actually bring industry on board, and how can we bring the stakeholders, the people who are our team members in architecture and the construction industries and the built environment, and how can we actually start the conversation with them in order to bring that forward. So I think really at the bottom point stands an education that collaborates with industry to shape strategies for climate change. So together with and for the industry. And so I've been trying to phrase a couple of adjectives how we would do that. And so I found 5 which I find interesting, and I was just going to run briefly through. So the first one is centered on a distribution of climate change that both acknowledges what the status quo actually is in the construction industries, which is something that doesn't always enter education, and that then focuses on the distribution of climate knowledge with facts, but also with workflows and processes. So centered. The second one is reciprocal, so making learning modules that are beneficial for students in a course content, but that also would bring real life challenges, and would also work for industry in the sense that industry gets an understanding of new methodologies and research. So it needs to be reciprocal in the sense that everybody has something out of that equation. The third one is inclusive. So I could also say holistic. So it would include multiple perspectives and also stakeholders. And when we're talking about industry, that means everybody who's part of that, not only in construction, but also in the building maintenance, in the sense of city maintenance and life environment maintenance. So industry and working with industry means construction trade, manufacturers, councils, urban planners, engineers, and of course also other architects in the process. The fourth one is making things small enough. That's not really an adjective, but I think that's important if we talk about climate challenge and the climate crisis. So coming from what every person can contribute for the development of solutions that are realistic, achievable, repeatable, and scaffolded. So something that breaks this overall problem really down into that you can personally grab and hold on to. And the last one is economic. And I see that as an economic chance. So in this whole context, and together with industry, we can actually define key positions for a circular chain. And when I say circular chain, I mean from education to industry, from industry back into education. And that would enable us to find new positions and new profiles for the architects through entrepreneurship and startups that provide the solutions for that climate challenge.
Thanks, Dagmar. That was great. I really liked what you're talking about, this circularity where we see higher education and practitioners working in parallel. I think especially given the challenge of what we're seeing, which is that students and educators and practitioners are all grappling with this rapidly changing domain of knowledge in parallel. It certainly calls for more innovative approaches to architectural education. We can't continue teaching the way we previously did when it comes to these particular topics. And I think these challenges can seem overwhelming, and especially when you see a degree that is bound by an accreditation framework like the NSCA, and quite substantial changes that we're seeing coming through for future accreditation cycles. And Phil, I believe, is UNSW going to be the first university to go through the accreditation according to the new framework? Is that
one of the first? I don't know who the others are. If anyone wants to own
there'll
up.
be a few in that year, in that group. But I guess given these changes that we're all anticipating, I'm curious, I think what we're seeing is having to try to grapple with new graduate capabilities and what we deem to be an employable graduate, having completed an architecture degree. And we can't expect our graduates to solve all of the world's problems after 5 years of study. So I'm just curious on your insights about what challenges and opportunities you think exist in attempting to reframe what our graduates are capable of.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think once the new NSCA came out, probably most of us around this table got our Excel sheets out and we're going, okay, where are we going to try and meet this one? Where are we going to try and meet this one? And it's a fiercely ambitious kind of framework, I think, for young architects in their early 20s to go out into practice, knowing this kind of wealth of information. But I do think it's important. I mean, if you're starting an architecture degree next year, 2022, when are you going to be graduating into practice? 2027, 28 at the earliest? It's going to look a bit different then. We're hoping that, the NCC will be down to net zero by 2030. So there is, there is a need for that kind of, but I think we've got to remember as well the NSCA's minimum expectations. Yeah. As schools, we have bigger, broader ambitions and identities and values that extend beyond the NSCA. We can do different things outside of that as well. And I'm slightly utopian in my beliefs of what a university is. It's not just about educating people to be useful in practice. It has a bigger kind of role. I remember, I was taught by Ted Cullinan, who said, university is where you're meant to fly. And I still think that kind of rings true. So I think there's still a broader expectation on education, and we don't want to narrow it down to be just training how to do carbon. But we know that carbon's important as well. We know that future architects need to be literate in these kind of numbers. So it's a very fine balancing act, isn't it, between maintaining a kind of generalist qualities of architectural education and layering in additional hard skills and technicalities as well. But I also think, look, if we did this questionnaire again, and we did this survey again now, and we went out to practice instead of students, do you think we'd see anything different? I think we'd get very similar results in that, quite concerned but lacking confidence. And this says to me that this role of education expands beyond the student. It expands beyond those, 5 years into lifelong education. And that if an entire discipline changes, we can't just change, the grassroots. We can't just change the education. We have to be looking at CPD. We have to be looking at lifelong learning. We have to be all in this together to shape and to craft our discipline to tackle this challenge. And that, look, I'm slightly excited by that, as well as hugely daunted. But that's the kind of key thing for me. It's the tick boxes in the NSCA, great. It's a good starting point. It's a good base, but we've got so much more we can offer.
Thanks, Phil. That's really exciting. I think what I'm most excited by is this shift to discovering new ways to teach architecture, those how questions of not just the topics that we need to be integrating into the curriculum, but how we might envisage alternative modes of subject types. Because I think it's fairly widely held consensus that we have this kind of formula that architecture education has the studio as the core, and it's sort of complemented by history and theory and technology units and electives, and maybe finding opportunities to integrate learning across all of them, across and throughout the curriculum would be really, that's what excites me about the future of architecture education. Naima, do we have any questions from the chat that would fit into the way the conversation's flowing?
Yes, we do have a question from Claudio. So Claudio says, it seems that postgraduate education in architecture has more exposure to transdisciplinary design studios, so something that you're already talking about, Liz. And Claudia says, however, students get to that level without much experience on the dynamic to design collaboratively. Could you further explore the current design curriculum's opportunities and limitations that are stopping undergraduate students from being prepared for work collaboratively towards environmental sustainability? So it's about the exploration of the current issues that hinder the transition and the change that we need to make in our curriculum.
I could try to speak to that a bit. Architecture is I think like learning to be an architect, it's a really special skill set. I think as many of us would acknowledge, the ability to synthesize lots of complex information and so on. And I mean, in some ways, there's that kind of expression, you have to learn to walk before you can run. There's a lot of core disciplinary knowledge that one has to learn. And we do follow generally a kind of tradition of learning, set things that are from within the kind of discipline within the canon. And then we kind of, fan out and start to integrate and overlap with other disciplines. And one probably needs to question that a bit. Is that still a relevant way to teach? Should we be throwing architecture students into cross-disciplinary environments right from the beginning so that they learn how to communicate? They don't default to the kind of jargon and the things which actually set up kind of, divisions and interiors between different disciplines. I was just discussing this with a colleague who was here today to review some work. We're just kind of speculating on that question of like, if engineers and architects started talking to each other well before they arrive in practice and kind of have that conversation for the first time, would you arrive at more sort of integrated and synthetic outcomes, for example? So I think, if what Claudio was saying is that there's a perception that undergraduates are kind of blocked or there's obstruction towards being able to develop that transdisciplinary focus, I think that's where a certain approach to pedagogical approach to a degree, curriculum design could start to make an impact upon that very issue. Because I think where architects I think are at their best is that ability to be to synthesize and to integrate, and also the ability to communicate. But I think it was Lenny Johnson, who's kind of a specialist in PR and helping architects communicate to her client base. She really likes to remind us that we can be really terrible at talking to the public and communicating our value. And so I think that also really speaks to just the point about both the bottom up and the top down, our ability to train architects to have that sort of individual at the coalface level of disruption or intervention or contribution to this issue in the space as a designer or as an architect or a graduate architect or an intern, obviously has a collective impact, but then the ability to work in the space as an advocate, as one who can help to drive change through policy and advocacy and having a different sort of voice. That's also a really, really important attribute and skill that we need to be enabling our students to be able to make a difference in as well.
Chris, further to that, the data showed that 95% of people agree that architecture can be part of the solution to climate change. And you're talking about the need for cross-disciplinary collaborations in architecture education. I'm curious what you think. Like, we know that the world needs interdisciplinary thinking to solve complex problems. But if we were to look at it from the perspective of the architectural discipline observing other disciplines, and then also other disciplines looking back at us, I'm curious what you think architecture has to offer in solving these complex problems, but also how other disciplinary domains might observe us and what we have to learn from those approaches and different ways of thinking.
Mm. Oh, well, that kind of brings me back to what Naomi said a bit earlier about, architects being the conscience, kind of having this professional conscience. And I mean, in some ways, often we are the, let's say, the defenders of the public realm, where we have this kind of mindset to, think altruistically and optimistically. So I think that as a kind of a trait is something I think that, if other disciplines look at architects and they say, well, that's a great trait, we should be a bit more like that. But then architects are, we can get really utopian and, sometimes a bit narcissistic and a bit of navel gazing that can happen, which I think is part of also, being a creative and enjoying and reveling in, creative pursuit and other forms of endeavor. But when I look at my colleagues across the way in the construction, department and whatnot, they definitely have a bit more of a let's get it done now and not fluff around sort of attitude, which I think architects could probably benefit a bit more from. I mean, there was a question in the chat as well about, which was from the anonymous attendee, the very first question that went into QA about, why is there such a disconnect between upcoming students and active practicing architects? And I think that's also this, I guess what I'm trying to get at sort of speaks to that dilemma as well. There's the commercial realities of practice, which I think was something that was also alluded to a bit earlier, which can temper our ability to be able to, take certain action if we're also thinking about, how we're going to meet payroll and other kinds of things. So, and then the problem with that is that architects, as much agency as we might have and as much opportunity as we have upstream to design the good into projects to, try to enact the net zero outcomes and positive outcomes that we need to have, we're not always going to be in a position where the clients, the projects, the regulatory framework, et cetera, are going to enable those projects to exist. So I think it really needs, we're part of the solution, but I don't think that we can also, we shouldn't kid ourselves that a bit of what we're doing right now is, it's actually a bit futile, for lack of a more colorful phrase, around being able to achieve some of these things. So it does really require a number of layers to be able to get there.
Although I wonder, Liz, if I can jump in, that it seems to me that one of the great strengths of architects and one of the ways in which we will be able to can vitally contribute to these, cataclysmic problem is in the ways in which architects are able to compellingly envisage, let's say, by which I mean both imagine and visualize other possible ways of working, and to communicate that in a way that's absolutely compelling and that can excite people and bring them on board and inspire them. So yes, there'll be a lot of, knocking heads against walls, but not, as in one's own head, I mean, not other people's heads. But I also think that is one of the key things that, that we have that is so valuable, that because of the, it's an inherently optimistic practice. Like, it imagines that there could be a better world and that we can intervene to make that happen through design. This is fundamental to architecture. It's fundamentally optimistic. If you didn't think you could make a better world, well, you wouldn't do it. So I really feel like this is a very Pollyanna kind of thing to say, but I really feel that this ability to inspire people and show that there are other ways of doing things, there are other worlds that are possible and can be brought into being, is one of the really important things for us to hold on to. I think architects can have radical hope and can show that and share that in a way that I just can't see that coming from the engineers. I mean, maybe I'm doing them a disservice and maybe they can, but or the builders, or I just think that architects as creatives, fundamentally, with a structured form of imagination, which is another way of thinking what architecture is, a form of structured imagination, we can do that in a way that some of our colleagues cannot.
Thanks, Naomi. Jim Gall has asked a question which Dagmar, I think you've indicated that you'd like to answer. So Jim's asked, can gathering around case study projects be useful, where a broad range of knowledge is brought to the learning, thinking, and proposed actions as needed, remembering the environment is everything?
Yeah, thanks. That's actually a classic one of hitting the wrong button, but I'm happy to.
Well, now you get to answer it.
I believe architecture is and design studio is in principle it's a case study. It's making prototypes. It's making new workflows. It's really taking an effective life problem and developing with the expertise of others that is intricately linked to the solution process. Is something that can be used. So in most of the design studios, I think most of us as educators here have by now taken on a practice that really brings other specialists in order to make that more rounded view of how we can tackle that. And this is why, the conversation about the architect, the architect, the architect is not going to solve anything, right? So the architect is only as good as the team partners, and as good as the biggest lens of the team that he or she has at their disposal. So I think we need to stop thinking that architects can save the world. And I think we need to really develop these better communication strategies that want everybody to come on board and to do that with us.
Yeah,
I
agree completely. No. I agree. Definitely agree. There's a question here that's a really tricky one, which is probably why I was a bit slow off the mark in responding to you, Dagmar, then, because I was deep in thought. And it's from an anonymous attendee, and it's talking about this difference or this tension between students and this clear intent to make that they want to be engaging with more sustainable design decisions, whereas in the real world, architectural firms might claim to be putting a lot of emphasis on sustainability, like through signing up to Architects Declare, but yet very few seem to be able to make design decisions in actuality with sustainability in mind. And I don't know what the answer to this is, so maybe I'll put it to the panel, and if anybody's feeling inspired, jump in. But why is there this disconnect between the appetite of what upcoming students want and what's going on with active and practicing architects? I think I'm immediately just thinking the reality of being bound by client interests and budget restraints and
money. In a word, I mean, it's pretty fundamental, isn't it? I mean, why do we build? And often we build for social value, but more often than not, we build for commercial value. What do we call houses? We call them real estate. Our discipline is driven by that kind of that finance, that drive, and I think that skews a lot of the outcomes, definitely.
I like what you said before.
I think we're calculating in a wrong way, right? We're never calculating the effective costs of what we're actually building. I mean, all the sort of grey energy that's already embedded in these buildings, and we're letting the client keep the costs and determine the cost for something that is a much bigger equation. So there should be something like a driver's license for a building, or even for constructing a building. So, there needs to be some sort of regulation that actually sort of takes the responsibility out of the hands of one person and distributes it. And there needs to be, sort of this longer perspective on what our decisions cost us.
It makes me think back to what Phil said earlier about university is where we should fly. And maybe to an extent, this is the way it should be, that students and universities is where the people really push the limits of innovation and what's possible beyond the constraints of a real world scenario.
But I also think, the way we often teach, we often teach students to challenge the conventional, and there are unconventional solutions that may not be apparent at first, which a creative designer may see, which can meet the needs of the client and meet the needs of the environment. And I think fundamentally, one analogy I have is building, the amount we are building. There's a carbon budget of 500 gigatons of CO2 emissions left. If we just built everything we're expected to build over the next 40 years, I think it works out at something like 66% of every carbon emission we can possibly have. So that says we just can't carry on building in the way we are building. It means we have to adaptively reuse. We have to build things that are hybrid and have multiple uses that might not be apparent at first. And that's, for me, key where architectural education and the practice of architecture can kind of come in seeing a brief or seeing a set of circumstances and challenging it and reinterpreting it and finding an alternative way that meets the needs of everybody and has societal value and has economic value and has environmental value as well. So again, it's possibly an optimistic view, but I believe there is an inherent value in that.
I'm just looking at the time, I'm thinking that that's a really good platform for us to begin to wrap up the discussion. And I'm wanting to know, on that notion of optimism and cause for optimism, if in a very brief snapshot, if others in the panel would like to share what gives you cause for hope and optimism about the future of architecture education and what we have to offer. I'll put you on the spot there.
Well, I'll be quick, so maybe I'll go first. I must say it's an effort for me to summon up optimism. I know that we have to have optimism. As you know, we were talking before about how despair is a luxury that we can't afford. So we must have optimism. There's no alternative. But I see, I look at my brilliant students and their creativity and their skill and their talent and their knowledge and their engagement. And I mean, without sort of dropping the heavy responsibility on the younger generation, there's definitely hope because there is so much human talent coming through. I think we have to help invest in, support, encourage, and train and educate those people.
Thanks, Naomi. Does anybody else want to help us end on a positive?
Look, I'd echo that. I see what a young architecture student can achieve in 12 weeks. And I go, okay, I've got 20 to 30 years. I think, look, I am optimistic, but, let's also frame that around the fact that we do need to change. We can't just rest on our laurels. I'm optimistic, although we're all change fatigued now as well and exhausted and, in several lockdowns down, we do need to change. I think that's something that I'm optimistic about, that we acknowledge that and that there seems to be trajectory in that direction.
Speaking of lockdowns, actually, I think COVID probably gives us some cause for optimism because it demonstrates this rapid transformation that's possible when everybody's collectively united in a common cause globally.
Yeah, I would just jump in also to say that, the fact that we're having this conversation, that we're, running this webinar, this survey, we've gotten to a point where we're having a conversation around a really important issue that we haven't had collectively before. So, thank goodness we've arrived at this point. I think also, a role of universities, if it's an opportunity for people to fly and to test, it's also a really important, I think, obligation or responsibility of universities to be the kind of engines that help drive change. And so we do, we have to, manufacture that. We have to cultivate that. And so part of that requires cultivating the optimism, cultivating the positivity in combination with, I think, the skills and knowledge and the capacity to bring that change. So I think we're very much doing that. And I think what's good about the survey also is that it does point to, I think, a shared sense that, there's things that we need to do, but that people feel a sense of motivation around this topic, and that we do see that happening in practice. And it's great that the institutes come on board with this project, and there's a lot happening now in that space which hasn't been happening previously, and that the NCSA changes have come through, and even in the commercial space, a lot of the kind of top listed companies are starting to divest from various portfolios and starting to make sustainable performance and whatnot one of their kind of key obligations or deliverables. So I think there are things happening, and I suppose one has to remain optimistic that all that's going to start to converge in the way that we need it to.
Dagmar, I think you had your hand up. Did you want to share?
Yeah, no, because I think that the optimism is like we have every grounds for optimism, because never before do we have so much knowledge, and never before have we had so many systems actually interconnected with each other, and never before have we had so much computational power to model and to analyze and to evaluate the consequences of what we are actually setting out to do. So we have the full technical equipment. We are able to deal with the big data, and we are actually in a space where very many different people are talking to each other. So I think now is a really good point not to lose hope, and to work with the brilliant people that are in our schools. And to take the most out of the capacity of what we can do best, develop visions, right, and bring everybody on board. So I'm actually looking quite forward to, sort of the next period.
Thanks, Dagmar. Well, I think that's a really good note to wrap up the discussion on. Thank you, Naomi, Dagmar, Chris, and Philip, for a really enlightening discussion. And thank you all to the attendees today. I hope that this was enlightening in some way. And we welcome any feedback. If you'd like to shoot myself or Naima an email with any observations or thoughts that you've had during our discussion, or some resources you think that we should be aware of, we'd very much welcome and appreciate that. And otherwise, enjoy your Friday night and a well-earned break over the weekend.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Naima.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Naima.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Beautiful.
Thank you to the entire panel and the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
Martha, would you mind ending the session?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks so much. I'll speak